Despite nearly a century of American domination following World War II, recent domestic and international developments are bringing into question the US's continued power and prestige in the 21st century. In light of massive deficits at home, huge adverse trade balances abroad, and the rise of powerful competing economies and institutions, could US supremacy be crumbling? In this video, we'll discuss the nature of the American empire, its current attempts at maintaining its prominence, and the indicators of its coming fall from grace as a world power. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video, and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Despite being the largest economy on Earth for decades, having essentially shaped the post-war world in the image of its own institutions, trade agreements, and military alliances, the US is currently facing its largest crisis of the unipolar era. The country's stagnant economic growth, particularly for working people who have seen no meaningful wage increase in decades, stands in stark contrast to Chinese economic growth, which threatens to eclipse the US in as little as 5 years. Independent economic centers continue to grow despite American efforts, and new alliances, both military and political, are beginning to challenge US domination, particularly in the resource-rich and overexploited imperial periphery. Despite the prevailing view of the US foreign policy establishment that decline is un-American, military matters continue to look bleak as an overstretched global military presence drains state funds while delivering little more than increased anti-American sentiment and geopolitical and military failures. Similarly, US-founded and supported institutions around the world, in everything from banking to science to diplomacy, are being challenged. The four pillars on which American global dominance was built include military strength, economic power, institutions, and soft power. All of these are being undone, mostly due to actions taken by the US ruling class themselves. As a self-described global police force, the US attempts to project decisive military power to Europe, West Asia, and the Far East, all areas deemed vital to American security and prosperity. Currently, the US controls around 750 bases in at least 80 countries worldwide. This military overreach is being met by a solid military presence in China, which has resulted in the receding frontier of US military dominance, according to the Rand Corporation. This too is reflected by the retreat of costly on-the-ground involvement by the American military, which instead favors a more hands-off approach through drones and airstrikes, especially in the West Asian region. The outlook isn't any better with scientific progress and renewable energy, where China has a commanding lead in AI development, quantum technology, and affordable green power, not to mention parity in missile delivery technology. These developments too are shifting European and other regional interests east, away from the US. Consequently, the slow death of American economic dominance is giving birth to a multipolarity led by the Chinese example. After the 2008 economic crisis and subsequent COVID slowdowns, China has taken the #1 spot in trades, exports, and manufacturing, an American-held privilege for nearly a century. Meanwhile, average Americans are bearing a debt and cost of living burden that has effectively rendered owning a home or even retirement an impossible dream for younger generations. Often underreported, though highly influential, is the increased presence and dominance of parallel international orders, with the increased influence of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and BRICS, despite unending American attempts to limit or undermine these institutions. US-dominated institutions such as the IMF and World Bank are under pressure to increase voting and other rights for rising members. Meanwhile, the G8 Global Economic Summit has expanded into the G20, indicating a global shift in the coordination of international economic policy away from the old centers of capital and those allowed in by post-World War II American geopolitical and economic interests. Much more importantly, the Washington Consensus, based on free markets, liberal democracy, and globalization, has been thoroughly discredited despite ceaseless American foreign policy attempts at maintaining the status quo. According to the political analyst Martin Jakes, that the American-run international economic system has been plunged into such turmoil as a result of a crisis which had its origins in the United States has served further to accentuate the loss of American power and prestige. The former US Deputy Treasury Secretary Roger Altman stated that the Great Recession put the American model of free market capitalism under a cloud. Even economic sanctions, the favorite weapon of the US ruling establishment for maintaining hegemony short of military action, has been losing its bite as an alternative network of trade and cooperation skirts the limits imposed by the US, with the country's lesser allies suffering as a result, particularly in the case of Russia. With all this said, what does the future look like? American domestic affairs remain bleak as political division increases to record highs, while social inequality skyrockets. Following COVID, over $1 trillion have been siphoned from the poorest Americans to the wealthiest. These volatile changes are met with cuts to temporary assistance for needy families, food stamps, and other welfare programs that millions of Americans rely on. Despite a still growing military budget of over $800 billion, the US has demonstrated an inability to project military power abroad, causing even the most patriotic Americans to question where all that money is going. More and more often, the answer to that question is funding proxy wars and genocide. Corruption continues to be covered up or even encouraged in the guise of political lobbying, even as life expectancy stagnates in light of a lack of equitable access to healthcare and preventative medicine. Most clearly of all is the opinion of everyday Americans, of whom a majority believe that the US will only continue to decline economically, lose standing geopolitically, and become more socially unequal and ever more politically divided. Strategically, China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which has seen dozens of countries sign up and investments totaling over $1 trillion, has initiated a redrawing of geopolitical lines in favor of a new and improved status quo, one which involves the movement of finished goods and raw materials across 3 continents, all outside American political or economic direction and oversight. This dislodging of American economic power, which kickstarted its global political supremacy post-World War II, will greatly diminish US ability to project and impose its will. Despite these glaring examples of American retreat, the lock-in thesis has gained predominance among those who recognize the US's decline, stating that a hegemon, by building an institutionalized, rules-based international order, can lock in favorable arrangements that continue beyond the zenith of its power. A flaw of this theory is the assumption that China has no interest in overturning or modifying the post-World War II international order. Their use of American-dominated institutions and a lack of international intervention since the 80s has allowed China decades of uninterrupted growth, in line with Deng Xiaoping's recommendation to lie low, hide your capabilities, and bide your time. A 2007 report by the Center for a New American Security concluded, rather than seeking to weaken or confront the United States directly, Chinese leaders are pursuing a subtle, multifaceted, long-term grand strategy that aims to derive as many benefits as possible from the existing international system while accumulating the economic wherewithal, military strength, and soft power resources to reinforce China's emerging position as at least a regional great power. The ruling administration in the US often talks of reforming the current world order, but the limitations on the expansion of American capital simply prevent these ideas from being seriously considered. This contradiction between the waning of one socio-political and economic hegemon and the emergence of a new power presents fresh threats of military conflict to maintain American dominance, spurred on by a more reckless capitalist class hoping to preserve profits over the lives of millions and the environment. No matter how much the US fights to prevent it, the world we are entering will be a multipolar world, run in accordance with complex political and economic alliances preventing the supreme hegemony of any single power. How the US will respond to this waning glory remains to be seen. If you appreciate the work we're doing here at First Thought, consider supporting us on Patreon so we can grow and expand.